So yesterday I spent really the whole time setting up what hopefully will be a few constructive thoughts. Yesterday was more devoted to deconstruction in a sense. I outlined what has over the past few centuries come to be increasingly a real crisis between religion and science, a real crisis particularly from the perspective of those who belong to traditional religious communities, a crisis because traditional ways of believing about God and religion have been eroded, apparently eroded by the onward march of science. One prominent scientist has actually referred to Darwinian theory as a universal acid that dissolves all religious belief. That's the sort of mindset that many people have about some of the consequences, in particular, of Darwinian theory. So I talked a little bit yesterday about what some of the arguments, what some of those arguments have been. Divided them generally into arguments concerning the existence of God, arguments concerning concerning religion as a social institution and its sort of legitimacy and whether it's outlived its usefulness. What I want to talk about a little bit today is suggest some possible, just make a few gestures in the direction of a solution. I can't obviously propose any sort of systematic solution, but what I want to propose will be, I think of it as fairly revolutionary, fairly thinking about things in fairly fundamentally new ways. There are others as well beyond the Baha'i community who are also coming to the same sort of conclusion that this kind of new thinking will be necessary to move forward. Here's a summary from one prominent theologian, actually, by the name of John Hout. In a very recent book, he writes the following: "Hasn't Darwin's evolutionary science placed in serious doubt the religious sense that we inhabit a meaningful universe? Or is it instead possible that what scientific skeptics often take to be the religiously ruinous consequences of Darwinian thought are in fact fresh openings to mysterious, sacred depths of reality previously unfathomed? And in these depths, will we find only an abyss of absurdity, or perhaps instead the sustaining presence of a truly living and renewing God, one who can command the fullness of our worship, and one to whom we might still pray with love and confidence?" So that's one example of a perspective from a non-Baha'i perspective, of those who look at this current situation, which seems, on the face of it, so bleak from the perspective of religion, and believes that there are ways forward. But these ways forward will involve thinking about things in a different way. It will involve a transformation in our perspective. So what I'd like to propose is the following: that we begin with one of the fundamental Baha'i principles, and this is the principle of the unity of science and religion. Abdu'l-Baha has stated, really in no uncertain terms, in Paris Talks, he says, there is no contradiction between true religion and science. When a religion is opposed to science, it becomes mere superstition. The true principles of all religions are in conformity with the teachings of science. If we take that as a starting point, take our commitment to the belief that whatever we conclude will ultimately be not only in accordance with science, but will also not involve any kind of backing away from or repudiation of the fundamentals of our religious belief. It will not involve any kind of backing away from the reality of that mystical connection between the soul and that which lies at the heart of all authentic spiritual traditions, that unknowable essence. How can we get both in the end, is the question that we'll be asking. And so we're going to try to go beyond what I've written up there and didn't properly explain yesterday, beyond this idea of Athens and Jerusalem. By Athens and Jerusalem, I mean a shorthand. Athens referring to the tradition beginning really with the ancient Greeks, the tradition which has evolved today into modern science, the idea that the human mind is capable of understanding the world around it, that through the operation of our rational powers, we have the ability to understand, to determine not just how the world works, but how we should live. There's this stream of thought with reason at its center, which can be sort of summarized in the metaphorical form of the city of Athens. And on the other side of it, historically, has been the city of Jerusalem, with revelation at its center, including and embodying the belief that we are not capable on our own of determining how we should live, determining how the world works, but we need to have that information given to us through divine revelation. This contradiction, or this apparent contradiction and this tension between the idea that mankind is the arbiter of his own destiny through his own rational powers, and the idea that mankind stands in constant need of a higher power to guide him onwards and upwards. It's this apparent conflict between Athens and Jerusalem that we have to transcend. I will submit that in the end we will find that the idea that Athens and Jerusalem are separate cities is really a figment of our imagination. Ultimately, reason and revelation are one and the same. And I'll hopefully be able to put a little more meat on those bones in the remarks that I'll be offering this morning. What I wanted to do was to look first of all at a few ideas, a few very suggestive results from modern science, particularly from modern physics, that tell us unexpected things about the nature of the physical world. The list could be quite long, but I'll confine myself, because of the shortness of time, I'll confine myself to three sort of general topics. And then I'll talk about a few, maybe three also ideas from the Baha'i writings, and try to connect them a little bit. So modern science has changed our understanding of reality in quite radical ways. Up until a century or two ago, the idea from the time of Newton until really the time of Einstein and the development of quantum mechanics, the idea was that science gave us a picture of the world as atoms bouncing around in an empty void of space, with there being really no concept, no place for the entry of consciousness, of any sort of power beyond the mere operation, the physical operation of atoms, which can completely be described by the laws of mathematics. This idea of this picture of the world was overturned in certain fundamental ways, and the path by which these ideas about the universe were overturned, the methodology and the single tool that scientists have used that has enabled them to unlock so many of the secrets of nature goes under the name, you might not expect this, the name of symmetry, the word symmetry. So I want to talk a little bit about symmetry and how important symmetry is as a concept that will ultimately also have potential applications in the traditionally what we think of as the spiritual domain. Symmetry, it's best described by a few examples. Symmetry is the idea that a certain object or a certain configuration, a certain entity, let me just give a few examples. A square, think of a geometric figure of a square. The square is symmetrical in the sense that you can rotate that square by 90 degrees and you end up with exactly the same square. You can rotate it 90 degrees again and you end up with exactly the same square. You can reflect that square in space. You can turn it in 3 dimensions, and again, you end up with exactly the same square. This is a very simple, intuitively clear idea. We all understand that much of symmetry. That in its basic, in the sort of the bare bones description, that's the heart of what symmetry is, that you can take an object, perform some operation on it, and you end up with the same thing. This idea, as simple as it sounds, has very profound applications in the study of the physical world. Profound and somewhat abstract applications. I'll give you a couple of concrete applications and then a couple maybe more abstract applications. One of the first applications of this principle of symmetry came when not the first astronomers, but astronomers more in the modern era, and I mentioned one yesterday, looked up in the sky and they realized that those points of light out in the night sky, if you translated those points of light, if you moved those points of light closer in, they would look just like the sun. And conversely, if you took the sun and moved it out farther away, it would look just like the stars. So there's a symmetry operation. You move the stars in closer, they look like the sun. You move the sun out farther, it looks like a star. An interesting consequence of that is that things which on the face of it seem to be very different, through a simple operation end up actually being identical to each other. So that's one simple example of what we might call a symmetry operation. Let me give a more abstract example. There's an old story which many of us may have heard of Isaac Newton sitting under the apple tree. And he's sitting under the apple tree lost in thought, and an apple falls from the tree onto his head. And from this, the theory of gravity is born. Well, how did he get to the theory of gravity? From feeling the apple hit his head. In that moment, as the story goes, we don't know exactly when he had the idea, but as the story goes, at that moment, Newton realized that whatever force pulled that apple from the tree and hit his head is the same force, ultimately, that causes the planets to circle around the sun. The symmetry operation here being move the apple out into outer space, and it'll do exactly the same thing as the planets are doing. So what he realized was that the power of gravity was a universal power. That force that keeps us on the earth is the same force that keeps the planets circling around the sun. This may seem very obvious to us now because we're used to learning in school about the force of gravity, and it's not a new idea to us that what keeps us sitting on the floor is the same as what keeps planets circling around the sun. But at the time, that was a revolutionary idea, and that led to a revolutionary and very powerful new way of describing one of the fundamental laws of physics. Let's move just one step more abstractly. Einstein's theory of relativity. He has two different versions, the theory of general relativity, the theory of special relativity. Einstein realized, and he came up with the realization that the laws of physics are unchanged whether you are at rest or in motion. There's a symmetry operation. You take this entire room and send it off at some velocity, high velocity, low velocity, and as we're sitting in this room, we'll find that the laws of physics will not have changed to us. Everything will be measured in exactly the same way. From this perhaps obvious intuitive realization, Einstein was able to deduce the unity of space and time. I mean, from very simple ideas, from very simple thought experiments, you're able to extrapolate to unify different phenomena which may, on the face of it, have seemed to be very different from each other, if not incompatible. So symmetry has undergirded a great majority of the great and most important advances of modern physics. Let me give a couple examples of how this has led to a revolution in our thinking about the basic processes of the world. One of them is that cause and effect themselves become relative and incidental things. To get into the details of this requires talking about calculus, and I'll avoid talking about calculus, but I'll try to summarize in the following way. There's a way of mathematically describing the laws of physics in terms of particles and forces and accelerations. Things bump into each other, it causes a force, it causes something to move. The way you calculate how things move is by looking at the force on a thing at a particular instant, and then at the next instant in time, you recalculate the force on that, and then at the next instant in time, you recalculate the force on that. It's all written in terms of cause and effect. This instant in time is the cause of that next instant in time, and everything is formulated in terms of accelerations, forces, and so forth. There's another equivalent way of writing the laws of physics, a way that includes, to use the mathematical term, that includes using an integral formulation instead of a differential formulation. The details of that aren't important, but what's important is that they're mathematically equivalent. But from this other perspective of writing the laws of physics, things are no longer described in terms of causes and effects. Things are now described in terms of a system operating in such a way as to minimize some quantity. The system will operate such that the following thing happens. This is a very subtle but profound difference in formulating the laws of physics. From one point of view, everything is seen in terms of causes and effects. From another point of view, things are seen in terms of the whole system is acting in order to minimize a certain quantity. Some of you may recognize in this a difference between a causal description and what is called in philosophy a teleological description. Teleology meaning an end-directed process. Why is this important? Why am I talking about this here? Because I believe that this causal versus teleological picture, which is a purely mathematical consequence of a modern formulation of the laws of physics, could be usefully mirrored in terms of our thinking about God's action in the world. How do we think about God's action in the world? We think about God as being the direct cause of things. That's our way of thinking about the activity of the divine in the world. But from modern science, we find that this picture, this idea of thinking about things in terms of cause and effect, is actually only one half. It's only one way of thinking about things. It's also possible to formulate things very precisely, very mathematically, in terms of a goal-directed process, which is oftentimes how we think about the the activity of the divine in the world. God acts such that a certain thing will take place. What I'm suggesting here is that there's a result from modern physics that relativizes our very notion of cause and effect. And that can have an impact in how we think about the relationship between God and the world. I realize I've done a very inadequate job of describing all this, but I just wanted to give a sort of brief indication of what's of where this might go. So cause and effect become part of. Let me put it in the words of one physicist. He says it in the following way: from the perspective of modern science, events don't have purposes or causes. They simply conform to the laws of nature. Believing otherwise is a relic of a certain metaphysical way of thinking. So aside from the relativity of cause and effect, another major advance in modern physics, also deeply tied in with the principle of symmetry, was the discovery of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, I'm not going to be able to describe it, even give you in the time we have. I don't think I can do any justice to it whatsoever. But to say a couple of relevant facts about quantum mechanics, a couple of relevant facts about the structure of things at the level of the smallest particles. Quantum mechanics not only tells us that the most elementary particles of creation can sometimes act as particles and at other times act as waves, and how they act depends upon how you observe them. But also, one of the results of quantum mechanics is that the difference between the distinction between the observer and the object being observed is complicated, to say the least. There's an example, a famous example in quantum mechanics, of a cat in a box. There's a cat in a box, and in this box is a jar of poisonous gas. This jar of poisonous gas is sealed. But what will break the seal of this jar of poisonous gas is the decay of some particular radioactive isotope, some sort of plutonium, whatever you want it to be. The decay of this radioactive substance obeys the laws of quantum mechanics, which means we cannot predict with any precision when that moment of decay will take place. We can only say the probability at any given point that decay will take place. So let's shut the box and the cat and this lethal contraption up, and then ask ourselves after a few minutes, is the cat alive or dead? And the answer is, from the perspective of quantum mechanics, the cat exists in a superposition of states. There's a 50% chance it's alive, and there's a 50% chance that it's dead. And that's as far as science can go. That's as far as the description of it can go. But of course, the cat itself knows whether it's alive or dead. Surely the cat itself knows whether it's alive or dead. This illustrates a basic problem, not a problem with the theory, because the theory it's a very precise theory, and it's been tested and retested in every possible way. It's the interpretation of the theory which is still causing scientists and philosophers to spill jars and jars of ink over it, because no one really understands what the consequence of this is. But they do know, and I think everyone is in agreement on the point that quantum mechanics leads us to rethinking the distinction between the subject and the object, between the observer and the observed. In everyday life, we think these are very clear. I'm me, you are you. What could be more clear? But at a certain level of things, at a certain fundamental of things, the distinction between the observer and the observed actually breaks down, and the two become entangled. The two become part of a single system. So these two ideas, both this relativity of cause and effect, and this relativity of the observer and the observed, which are quite fundamental to the structure of existence as far as modern physics has been able to discover, I think could have profound implications for how we understand certain ideas in the religious domain, in the sphere of the spirit of the spiritual. So what are these ideas, and how might modern physics have something to say or something suggestive to say about them? So I'm turning now to the last section, glimpses from the Baha'i writings. The first of these ideas has to do with the nature of God. Traditionally, and I want to just refer briefly back to the popular conception of God that the new atheists and atheists throughout time have been arguing against, and this is the idea of the God of the gaps. The idea that God is a being, like we are beings, which is omnipotent, which has these various attributes, which acts directly in creation. His hand is literally touching things. And the atheists say, well, how can this be? If this is true, there must be evidence for it. This is a stupendous claim. There must be corresponding evidence for such a claim. And so this idea of God as agent, this idea of God as a direct actor, has come under pressure by modern science. What do the Baha'i writings say about the nature of God? Baha'u'llah talks about God as being an unknowable essence. In one of his prayers he writes, At whatever time my pen ascribeth glory to any one of thy names, methinks I can hear the voice of its lamentation in its remoteness from thee, and can recognize its cry because of its separation from thyself. Baha'u'llah describes in another prayer, he says, if I attempt to describe thee by glorifying the oneness of thy being, I soon realize that such a conception is but a notion which mine own fancy hath woven, and that thou hast ever been immeasurably exalted above the vain imaginations which the hearts of men have devised. This is regarding the attribute of oneness itself. If we think of what could be the most fundamental thing we could say about God, we would say, well, there's one God, and that God exists. We can say, at least we can say that much. But Baha'u'llah here is saying that even oneness itself is an attribute that we can understand. If we can understand it, then by definition, this attribute cannot apply to that unknowable essence, which must be beyond all attributes, beyond all names. Abdu'l-Baha puts it in the following way in Some Answer Questions. He says that the divine reality is sanctified beyond singleness. How much more beyond plurality? There's a very important tablet of Abdu'l-Baha to Dr. Farrell, a Swiss entomologist. His life involved in the study of ants. But he had very interesting questions for Abdu'l-Baha, questions about the nature of the soul, questions about the relationship between God and creation. And Abdu'l-Baha had the following to say to Dr. Farrell about the attributes of God, the reality of this divine essence. Abdu'l-Baha says, when we say that the divine essence understandeth and is free, we do not mean that we have discovered the divine will and purpose, but rather that we have acquired knowledge of them through the divine grace revealed and manifested in the realities of things. Elsewhere in the same tablet, he says that these attributes and perfections that we recount for that universal reality are only in order to deny imperfections, rather than to assert the perfections that the human mind can conceive. Thus we say that his attributes are unknowable. The Bab goes even further, and he takes us into a completely different realm, I think. Takes us to a completely different place when it comes to thinking about the reality of God and our relationship to it. First of all, the Bab addresses this issue of God's being in the following way. He says, "No one hath ever been able befittingly to recognize him, nor will any man succeed at any time in comprehending him as is truly meet and seemly. For any reality to which the term being is applicable hath been created by the sovereign will of the Almighty, who hath shed upon it the radiance of his own self." He's saying, even whatever you say this exists, this has being, the Bab is saying that itself is a creation of God. The Bab goes even further in the following passage. This one may really send you for a loop. "He who worshipeth God through anyone but him, by gazing at his own self as the worshipper, and at God as the object of his worship, hath joined partners with God, and hath never worshipped him." What are we to make of that, in light of the fact that every Baha'i prayer is written from the language of the worshipper worshiping the worshipped? Our obligatory prayers tell us every day of our powerlessness and his might, of our poverty and his wealth. What are we to make of this dichotomy? Is this a contradiction in the writings? How are we to resolve it? It's these sorts of questions that people would sometimes write to Shoghi Effendi and ask him. He says this here, but he says this here. What do we make of it? In one of his letters, Shoghi Effendi responds that the Baha'i writings are like a sphere. There are points, poles apart, and in between are the thoughts and doctrines that unite them. And somehow I think we have to understand this question in similar terms. The Baha'i writings are filled with references to a personal God, references to an active God, a God of history, a prayer-hearing, prayer-answering God who is personally in our lives. At the same time, the Baha'i writings also contain many references to an invisible, transcendent, unknowable God completely detached from creation, who has no connection to creation. The merest suggestion of a connection with creation would be to reduce the reality of God to the level of creation itself. What are we to make of these two poles? Baha'u'llah, in the opening pages of Gleanings, gives, I think, a suggestion of to sort of continue one step beyond what the Bab says about the worshipper and the worshipped, and how this idea of seeing ourselves as the worshipper and God as the worship is ultimately a form of shirk, a form of joining partners with God. Baha'u'llah says the following, which I think helps maybe point us in a direction towards a resolution. This is in page 4 of Gleanings. He says, "Whatever duty thou," meaning God, "hast prescribed unto thy servants of extolling to the utmost thy majesty and glory, is but a token of thy grace unto them, that they may be enabled to ascend unto the station conferred upon their own innermost being, the station of the knowledge of their own selves." Baha'u'llah here seems to be saying that we are being asked, we are being directed and commanded to worship God as great, to worship God's attributes, not so much because we're worshiping an object, an entity that exists outside ourselves, like other people exist outside ourselves, but rather that the object is to discover that divine spark that lies within our own selves. And here we return to the Arabic hidden words of Baha'u'llah, where he says, "Turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee, mighty, powerful, and self-subsisting." So how can we understand then this duality, these two different pictures of viewing God either as transcendent, completely detached, completely separate from creation, and as immanent, that is, within creation, active in creation, within our own selves? I think one possible one possible direction is to look at this phenomenon of symmetry, which we know is so pervasively found and so foundational to the structure of things in the physical world. And if, as Abdu'l-Baha tells us, the physical and spiritual worlds are in fact mirror images of each other, whatever exists in the spiritual world, there's a reflection of that in the physical world, and vice versa. Could it not be the case that there's a symmetry principle at work as well in matters of the spirit? Could there be a symmetry operation, a translation of perspective that takes us from the transcendent God to the God of history, to the personal God? That's just a suggestion of how the two might speak to each other. A second point, so my first point on glimpses from the Baha'i writings is this idea of the nature of God and transcending the idea of God as object of our worship. If we follow the thread of this argument, if we say, okay, we won't think of God as, from this perspective, as we turn the sphere to this side, and we're now looking at this hemisphere, and for the moment the other hemisphere is out of sight. If looking at this side of things, we say, okay, we're not looking for an active agent in the world. We're not looking for a God whose activity can be discerned by any kind of laboratory experiment, by any kind of physical measurement, by any sort of tangible, measurable thing. Then how are we to find God? How are we to find God's activity in the world? Baha'u'llah, in the Tablet of Wisdom, gives us maybe a hint of an answer. And his answer may come unexpectedly, because it's the exact inverse of the God of the gaps. It's rather the God of the filled spaces, if you will. It's the God of nature. Baha'u'llah says the following: nature is God's will and is its expression in and through the contingent world. It is a dispensation of providence ordained by the ordainer, the all-wise. Were anyone to affirm that it is the will of God as manifested in the world of being, no one should question this assertion. It is endowed with a power whose reality men of learning fail to grasp. Indeed, a man of insight can perceive naught therein save the effulgent splendor of our name, the Creator. Baha'u'llah here is talking about nature. He's talking about that part of the world that we do understand. In a sense, Baha'u'llah is saying, don't look for God in the gaps. Look for God all around us. Look for God within every atom. Look for God in the sun. Look for God in the beauty and symmetry of the world around us, whose laws are a direct reflection of the will of the Omnipotent in creation. Abdu'l-Baha wrote a short commentary on the Tablet of Wisdom, and he affirms this. He says the following: Baha'u'llah says, it's a reiterating Baha'u'llah in the Tablet of Wisdom. It says, Baha'u'llah says that nature which they, the scientists, consider to be the source of all beings, is the manifestation of his creative name. It is the first cause that is the source of all beings and which has been interpreted as nature. The point is this: all the conditions and perfections that the philosophers attribute to nature are the same as have been attributed to the primal will in the Holy Scriptures. If that's not a revolutionary idea, I'm not sure what is. Traditionally, we think of God and God's action as apart from nature. Nature does its thing until God intervenes. We think of God as an agency outside the normal operation of the laws of nature. Whereas the picture that we have here is rather that nature itself is an expression of that agency. Now, of course, we have to think about the definition of words. What does Baha'u'llah mean when he says nature? Is Baha'u'llah's definition of nature the same as what a modern-day scientist would call nature, or is perhaps Baha'u'llah's definition of nature somewhat broader or more expansive to include things which we might think of as spiritual realities? And that's a point I want to get to. And I'll come to that point in one moment. So Baha'u'llah, by defining nature, identifying nature with the primal will, perhaps is illustrating for us another symmetry principle. Nature and the primal will. On the one hand, what could be more different than the action of a loving and compassionate and omnipotent creator in the world, and the mindless action of atoms and forces and fields that bring apparently nothing but pain and suffering into the world. If you look at Darwinian theory, nature is simply an arena of pain and suffering, of the eater and the eaten. How can that possibly be reconciled with the notion of a loving and compassionate creator? Could there be a symmetry principle involved? A very abstract one, of course, but one from which, from one perspective, we can say, yes, this is a description of the world which is complete from its perspective. But if you turn the sphere, if you rotate the sphere to the other side, you see things from another perspective. You see the operation of a loving providence in the world. What then would be the nature of that symmetry operation? Abdu'l-Baha gives us a picture of the world, and Baha'u'llah as well, but Abdu'l-Baha really crystallizes it for us. A picture of the world as an emanation of the Logos, an emanation of the Word of God. God, or if to use a term or a phrase that the Islamic mystics use, that the world is an exhalation of the breath of the merciful. But that's only the first half of it. The merciful exhales, speaks the word be, and it is. But then the second half is the inhalation, the inspiration, which draws creation back to the Creator. Abdu'l-Baha refers to these as the arc of descent and the arc of ascent. And along the arc of descent and along the arc of ascent are numerous degrees. Abdu'l-Baha refers to these as kingdoms of existence. He talks about the mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, human kingdom. He talks about the spirit of faith, the Holy Spirit. He talks about spiritual realms beyond the human kingdom, and spiritual, or, well, let's call them physical realms for the moment, but preceding the human kingdom. But what is spirit and what is matter? This is one of these ideas, like God and religion, one of these ideas that we may need to rethink. Going back to yesterday's comment about Cartesian philosophy, Descartes had the idea that there's material stuff and there's spiritual stuff. Two kinds of things that somehow interact in the world. Could it be rather that what we call matter and what we call spirit can actually be translated into each other through a symmetry principle, through a symmetry operation? What would be the nature of that symmetry operation? Moving up or down along the arc of ascent, along the arc of descent. Let me try to make that idea a little bit more clear. Abdu'l-Baha in one of his tablets says, and this is a very profound idea, but stated in just a very few words. He says, to the vegetable, the animal is a spiritual reality. Of course, to us, the animal is a purely physical reality. But to the vegetable, it's a spiritual reality. It seems that what we call matter and what we call spirit may not be so much a matter of it being a different kind of stuff, but rather what we call spirit is when we're looking above us towards God, and what we call matter is whatever is below us. One way of thinking about reconfiguring, perhaps, our ideas about spirit and matter. Abdu'l-Baha seems to confirm this in one of his great tablets called the Tablet of the Universe, which bewilders us in the scope of this statement. He says, earthly and heavenly, material and spiritual, accidental and essential, particular and universal, structure and foundation, appearance and reality, and the essence of all things, both inward and outward. All of these are connected with one another and are interrelated in such a manner that you will find that drops are patterned after seas, and that atoms are structured after suns in proportion to their capacities and potentialities. Universal and particular are in reality incidental and relative considerations. Certain fundamental categories of our thinking end up being relative considerations. We aren't talking about relativism, we're talking about relativity. Relativism is to say, well, in that case, everything goes. In that case, there is no underlying structure to things. You say this, I say that, we can't really decide amongst us. That's relativism. What we're talking about here is relativity, that there's a relativity of perspective from which, from one perspective, you can see God in creation, an agent in creation. From another perspective, you can see nature and nature's processes and mathematical laws. The two are one and the same. It's a matter of perspective. From one perspective, you can see matter, and from another perspective, you can see spirit, and so forth. This principle of relativity of religious truth, Shoghi Effendi has called the most fundamental teaching of the Baha'i Faith, the axis around which the teachings of the Baha'i Faith revolve. This principle of the relativity of religious truth, which in one of its manifestations is seen in perhaps the more familiar idea of progressive revelation. And I wanted to end my comments on this theme of progressive revelation. Progressive revelation is one aspect of the relativity of religious truth. And I think an understanding of progressive revelation, and in particular the cyclical nature of religion, can help understand the attacks that are being launched against religion by these new atheist authors and others. Attacks that are very well grounded. If you look at what is happening in the name of religion, if you look at what is happening in Iran potentially today, then we see and we have to admit to so much of what these authors are saying when they attack religion as an institution. But at the same time, if we see and understand the organic nature of religion, religion itself evolves just as humanity itself has evolved physically over the eons. Religion evolves, but not in a linear sense. It evolves in cycles, just like the cycles of the seasons, cycles of birth and decay. And that where we are at now is at this deepest winter of unbelief. And we represent those tiny seedlings that will eventually grow into the tallest trees. But with that perspective, it can help us understand and really agree with, in its own terms, so much of what these authors are saying, so much of how they're expressing their discontent with the idea of belief in God, with the idea of religion as a progressive organization, as a progressive force for change. With these concepts, we can perhaps help to forge a new language, to forge a new conceptual framework from which we can better explain the Baha'i revelation. At the very beginning, or towards the beginning, yesterday, I mentioned this statement by one of these prominent authors, that the idea of God is an extraordinary claim and it requires extraordinary proof. And in part, my answer is, well, he's looking for proof for the wrong kind of God. If you believe in a God of the gaps, then I don't think you're going to find that sort of a proof. But there is another kind of extraordinary proof which we can offer. Not a logical proof, certainly, but the proof of transformation. Ultimately, I think it's me personally, in my way of looking at it, it's the transformation of of people and the transformation of societies, which offers the best proof of the validity of any particular spiritual message. Baha'u'llah himself says as much in the Kitab-i-Gan. I don't have the quotation with me, but he says, if the character of mankind be not changed, the futility of God's universal manifestation would be proven. Which places upon the Baha'i community, I think, an enormous burden and enormous responsibility. I guess burden is the wrong word, enormous privilege, an enormous responsibility to make ourselves an example of that change that we want to make in the world, to make ourselves the living proof of the reality of Baha'u'llah's revelation. Thank you very much.